Dean Baker, co-director at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. I'd say a very mixed picture. I mean, he's done some things that were very big, very important. The stimulus package he got passed in his first month in office, it was important. It was a big step towards combating the downturn. He's gotten health care on the agenda. He has plans in his budget to start on health care, and he's worked with Congress to have it included in the reconciliation process, which means the Republicans can't filibuster it. He's also put forward ambitious plans on energy, which, again, that's part of the stimulus. So he's done a number of big, important things. Extended unemployment benefits, changing the formula so that a lot of people that had not been covered previously are now covered, and provided health care benefits. People who are unemployed will have 65% of their unemployment, their health care benefit covered by the government, which will make it affordable for a lot of people that could not otherwise afford health insurance once they lost their job. So a lot of good things. Where I'd give him bad marks is dealing with the financial system. We had a really big problem with finance run amok. That's what got us here. That's what led to the downturn. And it has to be reined in, and he doesn't seem prepared, or at least he hasn't seemed prepared at this point, to really take the hard steps to rein in Wall Street. And what I worry is that we're going to get out of this, one, costing the taxpayers huge amounts of money, because we're looking at spending at least hundreds of billions and quite possibly over $1 trillion in a bailout of the banks. And two, basically leaving them in shape, leaving them as they were, being prepared to run amok again. So I think it would really be unfortunate. It's a really big drain to the taxpayers. It's a huge amount of money. We've had big fights over sums that were less than a hundredth as large. And then on top of that, not to wrestle back this sector when it's really crying out for serious regulation. It really has to be reined in. Wall Street has to serve the rest of the economy. When you have an economy that's being run to serve the financial sector, you're asking for trouble. It's a mixed picture. I don't think it will ever fully end. I mean, the basically Reaganomics, put simply, was trying to get low taxes for wealthy people. And they're still there pushing for low taxes. So obviously President Obama said, and I expect him to carry through on this, that he will restore the Clinton-era tax rates, so high-end people will pay somewhat higher taxes. But it's not as though the people pushing for lower taxes are about to go away. And basically it's going to depend on President Obama's performance. If he does well in office, if 2012 we see the economy recovering, I don't expect it to be fully recovered, I don't think anyone does, but the unemployment rate down and heading in the right direction, the economy growing strongly, he'll get reelected, and that's going to push back the people who want to have lower taxes. But, you know, they're still there. Now, as far as the larger agenda, having a pro-business agenda, all that's very much up for grabs. Again, I was referring to Wall Street. Is Wall Street going to be reined in? You could see that's part of Reaganomics. I would, the Wall Street running amok. And we don't know that at this point. Healthcare reform is a huge issue. I think President Obama is pushing the right way, but it's far from a done deal that he'll get any healthcare reform, and certainly not a done deal that he'll get, to my mind, effective healthcare reform, which would involve first and foremost the creation of a good public plan that would compete with private insurers. So there's a lot of question marks there. He's certainly taking a different path than what President Bush did or had Senator McCain done if he had become president, but it's way too soon to pronounce the year of Reaganomics dead. Their view, I think, is to basically set things back to where it was before the crisis. I mean, they're talking about some pro forma changes, but it seems to me very little of real substance will change if they have their way. Now, I don't take it as a done deal that they'll have their way, because obviously there's huge anger at the financial industry, at Wall Street, and much of the public, including some people in Congress, would like to see things changed. But the reality is that even in spite of what we've just seen, Wall Street remains an incredibly powerful lobby. They give a huge amount of money to candidates for both political parties. So I think it's very much up in the air. I mean, if I were placing a bet simply to try and win some money, I'd bet that not much changes. One of the things I should have said in there actually certainly is getting money to state and local governments, because they're making cutbacks right now, and that's the quickest way to boost the economy, is not have the cutbacks. But in terms of infrastructure and green tech, there's a lot of good things that we can and should and are doing. The problem with that is stimulus is I'm not sure we could do all that much more than we're doing at the moment. So basically Obama's team, and I think they were pretty conscientious about this, they looked over the budget and they tried to think of everything reasonable they could spend money on. Not to say they got every last thing, but they tried to look at everything reasonable that they could spend money on 2009, 2010, and they threw as much money as they thought they can get through Congress out there. There are some things certainly I shouldn't say they necessarily overlooked. They might have decided otherwise and perhaps made the wrong decision. I mean, one thing that jumps out at me is why not subsidize mass transit? Why not suppose we just said we'll subsidize every ride that anyone takes anywhere in the country? I mean, be a little more systematic than this, but we'll pay a bucket for the ride. Well, that will give people a lot more incentive to use mass transit, and also put money in the pockets of people who use mass transit, who tend to be more lower, moderate income people. So that would have been a good thing to do. It wouldn't have been a huge amount of money, probably on the order of 15, 20 billion a year, but that would have been a very good thing to do. So there are some other things like that, but in terms of having some massive green program, I don't know we could have gone on much larger scale than what President Obama did. Now, if we wanted to lay something out for 2012, 2013, 2014, that might well be worth doing, and frankly, given the state of the economy, I think it's extremely unlikely that we're going to be fully recovered, anything close to that, by 2011. So if we look to spending that took a little bit longer to roll out, I think that really is fine. So I think we should look to do some more by way of conservation, promoting alternative forms of energy than is in the stimulus package, but I don't think that will be the major source of stimulus for the economy. In an orderly way. I mean, we did have a problem. You go back to September of 2008 when Lehman went under and the financial markets froze. That was a problem. I wouldn't say that was a good thing. If we don't want to see that happen again. I'll say two things about that. One, that was not the end of the world. I don't want to be there again. I'll be real clear. I don't want to be there again. But it was not as though the world was about to end. We would have been in an unpleasant circumstance where if things had kept going down that path, the Fed basically would have had to step in and take over the banks. They actually had a plan to do that in the 80s when Latin American debt had left many of the big money center banks then too also on the edge of insolvency. And as I heard from the former head of the FDIC, the Fed at that time had a contingency plan that had Mexico or one of the other big debtors outright defaulted. They simply would have stepped in and taken over the banks. Presumably we would have looked at that sort of situation. That wouldn't have been good, but the idea that the economy just would have come to a screaming halt and we'd all be sitting here without being able to use our credit cards, not get access to our money in our bank account, that might have been 24 hours, something like that, a scary period, but the economy would not have ground to a halt. So the worst case scenario, just to be clear, it was not we'd all be sitting here with a 21st century economy but no means of payments. That would not have happened. But the second point is we have a lot of mechanisms, a lot of safeguards that were put in place post-Lehman. So we now guarantee deposits up to $250,000. We guarantee all non-interest-bearing deposits. We're guaranteeing money market mutual funds. So there's a lot of safeguards in place today that were not in place back in September of 2008. So if we were to have a controlled bankruptcy of a Citigroup, of a Bank of America, I'm fairly confident that we can get through it. I can't say for 100% certain that we won't have, again, a sort of panic that we had back in September, but I think there's good reasons to believe that we won't have that. And again, even in that very worst case scenario, which I don't think would happen, but even in that very worst case scenario, we are prepared to deal with that with extreme measures, which again, none of us want to see, but I think that might be better. The risk of that might be better than just perhaps giving as much as $1 trillion to the banks. I think what you have is a situation that's enormous pressure for conformity, certainly among economists. So when you had top economists, certainly Federal Reserve Board Chair Greenspan, Bernanke, his successor, saying there was no bubble, and many other prominent economists agreeing with that view, most economists didn't want to step out of line and either contradict them, or for the most part, they probably never even looked at it closely. And you did have, I was out there talking about this since '02, there were a few others, not a lot, but we're easily enough to ignore. So I think most economists are relatively narrowly focused on their careers, and picking a fight with the Federal Reserve Board chair generally isn't the best way to advance your career. So to take the flip side of this, if you go, okay, who's suffered a price? Who's lost their job? Or let's put it even more narrowly, who's missed a promotion because they didn't see the housing bubble? And you'd probably be hard-pressed to find anyone. So looking at economists the way economists would look at other people, if you say, what are the structure of incentives? Well, the structure of incentives to go around talking about a housing bubble, it just doesn't pay because, one, you could be wrong. I was pretty confident of what I was saying, but none of us are perfect, so you could be wrong, in which case you'll be a laughingstock. And in the meantime, if you go the other way, if you just say the same thing that Alan Greenspan says, no one holds it against you. So you take a really big risk by stepping out of line. Very little obvious payoff. I mean, I get some more interviews or whatever, but it's not. I haven't gotten rich by this. And if you just say the same thing as everyone else, you basically bear no risk, no consequence. It doesn't surprise me they're not lending out the money. We were given many, many different explanations for the TARP at the time they were trying to push it through. Basically, they were throwing everything against the wall and seeing what would stick. What made sense was that you had banks that were on the edge of insolvency and needed money to keep from going under, and I think that was true. And in that context, it's not the least bit surprising that they're not anxious to lend money. They have to build up their loss reserves. On top of that, one of the big reasons why they're not lending money is there aren't good creditors out there, good debtor options. So they're not seeing people come to them who look like good credit risks right now, so they're going to be very hesitant to lend money. So that's not all that surprising to me. Now, the Goldman Sachs story is one that's really amazing. They're saying they don't want, this is no way to run a business. That's what Lloyd Blankenford, the CEO, said of Goldman Sachs. Well, no, it's not. But on the other hand, you just took $12.9 billion of public money given to you through AIG. You did business with a bankrupt company. So you're out of luck there. But the federal government stepped in and said, no, we're going to honor AIG's obligations. We have no legal or moral obligation to do that. And we handed them $12.9 billion through AIG, no strings attached. On top of that, he borrowed $25 billion with an FDIC guarantee. Now, I haven't looked at the market spreads closely, but I have to believe that must save him at least 2 percentage points against what he'd have to pay if he didn't have a government guarantee. So that comes to $500 million a year. On top of that, he has access to several different Fed lending facilities. We don't know how much he's borrowed there, but what that means is he could count on getting money from the Federal Reserve Board at a lower rate than he would pay through the market, almost without limit. I mean, I assume at some point Ben Bernanke, the Fed chair, would say, I'm not going to lend to you, but certainly he can get tens of billions of dollars, if not hundreds of billions of dollars without limit. So he's telling us, okay, I'm happy to get money through all these three channels that have no strings attached, but when it comes to your TARP money that strings attached, no, I don't want it. Well, yeah, I understand him wanting to do that, but I don't have much sympathy for that. So I'm more inclined to say, fine, give up all your money, give us back the $12.9 billion, repay those loans that you took out with FDIC backing, swear off going to the Fed windows, and fine, then no strings attached. But this is classic nanny state. He wants the money, he doesn't want the strings. We'd all like to have that, but most of us aren't CEO at Goldman Sachs. Well, it's definitely going to undergo a downsizing simply because the climate doesn't exist for it to maintain its pre-existing form. I mean, you saw two big investment bank, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, go under. The sorts of risks that they had been taking simply aren't viable simply because people won't lend them the money. I mean, the key part of the story of what was going on 04, 05, 06 up to the crash in 07 and 08 was that you did have investors all over the world who trusted Wall Street. They believed the investment grade ratings on the mortgage-backed securities and other instruments coming on Wall Street. They don't believe that anymore. So without having basically an endless supply of gullible investors, Wall Street has no choice but to downsize. So it is certainly going to be smaller, at least for the immediate future. But the question is whether the structure is going to change, and that's what I'm not sure of. And if the structure doesn't change, then what I worry about is over time we just get back pretty much to where we were, and that's not a good place to be. It's a good question, and I'm not sure at this point. I mean, I don't think that's their intention. There was an article in the New York Times just a couple days ago was talking about Goldman Sachs. I was talking about Wall Street more generally, but Goldman Sachs was the real model here, that they're basically back where they were in terms of salaries to the pre-crash days. So the average compensation there is pretty much what it was back in 2007. So they don't intend to change. So if there's not something that forces it on them, they're not going to change. Now, it can be forced in different ways. On the one hand, you have a lot of stockholders at these places that are very angry with good cause because they were paying out very high salaries and they lost their shirts. The value of most of these stocks, certainly Bank of America, Citigroup, it's down by 90%. It would be down probably 100% if it weren't for the government bailouts. But yet the people who put these companies, nearly put them out of business, they walked away with huge salaries, and many of them are still there. So stockholders may change it on their own. Part of the story with many of the pension funds, with the hedge funds, is they got their money from state and local pension funds, or in some cases private pension funds. Basically, are being ripped off because in many cases they weren't getting returns that justified that. I mean, the story was, give us your money, we'll give you these 20% returns, and you shouldn't mind that we're walking away with salaries of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Well, they weren't getting 20% returns. A lot of that was bogus, and certainly through the crash, many of them did very poorly. So basically, they're ripping off pension funds. One hopes that these funds will turn around and stop doing it. But you might well, and I would like to see government regulation. The simplest regulation I could envision is simply changing the rules of corporate governance. This is, again, the government set rules of corporate governance now, so it's not as though we'd be doing an intervention we don't currently do. We just need different rules because they're not effective. Many of the rules of corporate governance are designed to protect minority shareholders, so we can't get 50.1% of IBM and tell the other 49.9% they're out of luck. They protect the minority shareholders. Well, they also have to protect the shareholders against abuses by the executives, and they're clearly not doing that right now. Basically, the top executives appoint the boards, who then are very happy to approve very high pay packages for the top executives. That's not a big surprise. That's the way things work. So what you have to do is try and redress that balance. And the best thing I could think of is simply to require that pay packages, compensation packages of the top paid people get sent out to shareholder approval at regular intervals, 3 years or 5 years, and also that this be a serious vote, that non-return proxies, I mean, this is kind of a scam that with corporate votes, that they're allowed to count non-return proxies as supporting management position. I always say this is like we had our elections for Congress, and everyone that doesn't vote is counted as voting for the incumbent. I mean, it's very much a rigged election. So you go, no, it's a real election. You're only going to count the votes that are returned, and if they don't approve your pay package, then you have to come back with another pay package. I'd be very surprised if we're not looking at an unemployment rate over 10% by the end of the year, and quite likely crossing 11% sometime next year. In a good case scenario, we'll start to see the unemployment rate coming down in 2010, but it's still likely to be in double digits by the end of 2010. But that's what's really front and center. Now, how long does it take us to get back to a more normal unemployment rate? That's going to depend a huge amount on policy. I think we very badly need another stimulus, probably even larger than the last round. At this point, there's little political will in Congress and certainly the Obama administration to take the lead on that. But my hope is that as the economy continues to deteriorate, I don't hope that it continues to deteriorate, but as that will happen, I think it will, I don't think there's any two ways about it, that you will see more pressure on Congress to do something about it so that by the summer you do have people talking about another round of stimulus. So if that happens, we do get a big boost to the economy, then the economy could start to recover more quickly, and perhaps in that scenario we will see the unemployment rate under 10% by the end of 2010. Well, the reason why I say that with national health care is that for stimulus, you want to be able to look to somewhere you could spend a lot of money quickly, and healthcare has the advantage that it's a huge, huge sector. It's a $2.4 trillion. It's about 17% of the economy. So you could reasonably look to expand that, and you could look to expand it relatively quickly. And the way I proposed doing that was an employer tax credit, where we have somewhere around 40 million workers that don't get employer-provided health insurance. So if we gave employers a tax credit of, let's say, $3,000 a worker to give those workers health care coverage, then my guess is an awful lot of them would do that. And what that would fairly quickly do is, on the one hand, it would employ people in the insurance industry, not something I'm anxious to do, but as a stopgap, that's a good thing to do. It would give people health care, employing them in the healthcare sector. And to some extent, of course, these people, even if they don't have insurance, are paying it out of pocket. So what that would mean is they will pay much less out of pocket. They'll have more money to spend. And these tend to be more moderate income people, so they are likely to spend it. So I thought that could give a good boost to the economy. Now, to actually transform healthcare, we have to go further. I want to see us have a public plan that people could buy into. But the idea would be, let's take advantage of the fact that we actually just need to create demand. So in a certain sense, we don't mind the waste. Waste right now is fine. But what we could do is, one, give people coverage at the word go, and then say 2011, 2012, presumably we'd have a national health care plan ramped up that people could buy into if they chose, and then we'd have a mechanism in place that could start to control cost. So I think that would be a very good way to look to do something short-term, boost the economy, and really jumpstart us towards national health care insurance, which has to be top priority on anyone's, to my mind, on anyone's agenda right now. The other sort of, to my mind, good way to do stimulus is big stimulus, I should say, is what I've called a pay-or-play tax credit, pay-for-play, I should say, which would give employers a tax credit for providing workers with paid time off. So the way it would work is we pick a sum of money, let's say $2,500 per worker, and we tell employers that we'll pay them to offset any amount of paid time off that they give their workers up to $2,500 a year. And the paid time off could take the form of paid sick days, paid parental leave, paid vacations, shortening the standard work week. And what that would do is, on the one hand, it would directly get money into workers' pockets, but more importantly, at least in my view, more importantly, that we're giving a benefit that people are likely to value. We're way behind the rest of the world, by the way, in this front. Everywhere else, if you look to Germany, Britain, any country you pick, they all have paid sick leaves, paid vacation, paid parental leave. We're really the outlier that way. So it jumpstart us that way. But in terms of the economy, the stimulus to the economy, let's say we got employers of 100 million workers to take advantage of this, and they shorten the work time of their workers an average of 5%. Well, they're seeing just as much demand as they did previously, because the workers have just as much money in their pocket as they did previously, but they get 5% fewer hours. In principle, what they're going to want to do is hire 5% more workers. That translates into 5 million jobs. So the nice part of this story, instead of 5 million people being unemployed, we have 105 million people now employed, and they're all working so much shorter hours and taking this instead of unemployment as leisure time, as paid vacations, paid parental leave, whatever it might be. So I think that's a very good way to deal with sort of this basic problem. We don't have enough demand in the economy at the moment. One, we do want to increase demand, but two, why not just let everyone work shorter hours? I think restoring the tax rate to the Clinton era rate is a good one, maybe go a little bit higher. I'm wary about going too much higher because I think there is something to, not so much the disincentive effects. I mean, the classic story that the conservatives like to tell is if we tax people 50%, they wouldn't work. I don't believe that. I just worry more that you create a lot of incentives for gaming, for tax shelters. So I don't mind the Clinton era top rate was 39.6% on the highest income people. You could certainly knock that up 2, 3, 4 percentage points. I don't think you run into big problems. But if you pushed it too much higher, I think you would have problems. I would want to get rid of a lot of the unfairness in the tax code. One of the things that jumps out at me that President Obama actually is addressing in his budget is this what I call the fund manager's tax break, where if you run an equity fund or hedge fund, you pay taxes at the capital gains tax rate rather than the normal income tax rate. That allowed many of the wealthiest people in the country to pay a tax rate of 15% as opposed to you might have a firefighter who pays a tax rate of 25%. That was pretty unfair. So I'd like to get rid of that. And actually along those lines, I'd actually like to see capital gains income taxed at the same rate as ordinary income as well, which was actually a Reagan era reform. So that's not that radical notion. In 1986, they had capital gains income taxed at the same rate as normal income. So those would be some of my priorities. The last one that I think is a really good way to raise money, both since it raises a lot of money and also reigns in the financial industry, is a modest tax on financial transactions, stock trades, sales of options, futures. If you had a very modest tax, England taxes a stock trade at a quarter of 1%. So if you buy a share of stock, you pay a quarter of 1%. Same when you sell it. They raise the equivalent relative to their economy of $30 billion a year on that. I would apply it to broader instruments. I'd also have it on options, futures, credit default swaps, the whole range. Lower rates on those instruments, but the whole range of financial assets. You could easily raise over $100 billion a year that way. And that's a tax that would have a minimal impact on people who are investing. Again, they won't like the tax. No one ever likes to pay taxes. But no one who's looking to hold stock for 5 or 10 years is going to be that affected by paying a quarter 1% when they buy it and quarter 1% when they sell it. But it will have a very big impact on the people who are actively trading, buying at 2 o'clock, selling at 3 o'clock. And also the other big impact will be on the financial industry. It will take a chunk out of the hide of the financial industry, which, again, I don't have a problem with. It has grown too large. This is a very good way to rein it in. And sort of the way I think about it is that if you go to gamble at Atlantic City, you get taxed. You pay a tax about 6% on your gambling, not on your winning, just on your gambling. We could do the same on Wall Street. I'd say a couple points in immigration. First off, we have to be clear what's going on. I mean, we've had a policy of people come over and work here, and that's been explicit policy, even though it violates the law. And the idea was that gave cheaper labor than you could have gotten by hiring domestic workers. And that's two effects. Obviously, we have all these people come in from poor countries, work at lower wages. And secondly, it does have an impact on the less educated portion of the workforce. And I know there's some economic literature and that finds mixed results, but I'm inclined to agree with those that do find to have an effect and just sort of at the face of it. when you talk about having more than 10 million workers come in competing with you, it's a little hard for me to believe that doesn't have a downward impact on your wages. But anyhow, what I would say is we do want to give those people full rights, let them become citizens if they choose, let them whatever, have green card status, whatever we might do that, ensure that they have the full rights of workers in the United States and enjoy, be in a position where they can improve their situation on the job, improve their living standards. You are going to need regulation of immigration going forward, which I think has to be done at the employer level. There have to be serious sanctions. Now, the high-end workers, we have in effect had employer sanctions. You don't have hospitals and law firms and universities just bringing in huge numbers of immigrants and undercutting their existing workforce. That's actually against the law, and no one really tries that because I think if they did do that, they would be cracked down on. So you don't get Walmart University or Walmart Hospital bringing in a huge number of professionals from India or some other country. And I think that's actually unfortunate because I think it would benefit the developing countries, benefit the United States to allow a more free flow of highly skilled immigrants. And it would benefit us because we would get, it's the exact same argument we make about trade, except it would be at the high end rather than the low end. We would get these services, medical services, legal services, on down the list, at much lower prices if we allowed people from developing countries who are willing to work for lower wages, because their wages in their home country are so low that it would still be a big jump up if they worked for 2/3 the wages that our professionals receive. So we would get a huge benefit that way. Those workers themselves would hugely benefit since they would see a huge increase in living standards. And we could structure it so that the countries benefit, so we in effect have some sort of tax associated with basically repaying for their training costs in India, in China, whatever country it might be, so that they might be able to educate 2 or 3 doctors for every doctor that came to work in the United States. So I think we could structure this in a way, economists like to talk about trade as being a win-win. It's often not that way. You have a lot of losers in that story. We could structure this in a way that actually is a win-win, where people in the United States would gain, the immigrants coming to work here would gain, and the home countries would gain as well if we ensured that a portion of those wages were in effect repatriated back to the home countries to educate more workers. It's interesting. I assume you're referring to the bankruptcy reform passed a few years ago. It's kind of striking that because now one of the issues that's been hotly debated in Congress is an effort to change bankruptcy law so that people who go into bankruptcy could have the terms of their mortgages reissued, because right now mortgages enjoy privileged status that contract alone cannot be reworded by a bankruptcy judge. So they could write down credit card debt, car loan debt, any other form of debt, but residential mortgages cannot be rewritten. And one of the arguments that the banking industry has trotted out is they've talked about the sanctity of contract, that we don't want to create uncertainty. Now, back a few years ago, they changed the bankruptcy law to make it much harder for people to declare bankruptcy. And then they actually did reword contracts. So you could have borrowed money under the old bankruptcy regime where it was, I won't say easy, but at least much easier to go into court and have your debts annulled. And then they changed the terms of the contract on you, so it became much, much harder. So it's kind of striking, this sort of inconsistency. But I would argue that in general, you do want people, when they're in over their heads, to be able to go into bankruptcy and alleviate much, if not all, their debt. 2 reasons. One is as a moral issue, that typically people who, we know, we have data on this, most of the people who end up in bankruptcy, it's not that they were spendthrifts, they've lost their job, there's a family breakup, there's a health problem. That accounts for the overwhelming majority of cases. So it really was people falling in bad straits. The second, as an economic consideration, what we're saying, if we have sort of punitive bankruptcy law that we really, I would say, have now, we're in effect imposing large taxes. We're having the government chase after people to in effect tax their income, often at very high rates. And all these people complain about taxes. Well, it's the exact same thing if you're in effect having your wages taxed to repay old debts. So rather than having the government chase after people to force them, 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, pay debts that they incurred maybe when they were very young, I think it makes much more sense to say, okay, if you end up in bad straits, you're not going to have to repay the debts. And let's flip this over. No one gets into debt like that unless someone lent them money. So what this means is that there was a bad decision on the part of the lender. They judge credit risk poorly. And again, thinking from a free market standpoint, if you judge credit risk poorly, well, then maybe you're not a good business person. Maybe you shouldn't be in business. So in effect, what we said with the change in the bankruptcy law, we were rewarding bad business practices. You had a lot of businesses that had made loans to people who couldn't afford to pay them back, And rather than telling those businesses, well, next time be more careful on who you lend money to, we said, oh, we're going to help you get that money back. And I think that was absolutely the wrong way to go. Well, I take a very mixed stance on small business. I mean, I think we want people to be able to start businesses, want to create opportunities for them, make sure that you have a level playing field. But I think in many ways we've gone overboard. There's all sorts of provisions in the tax code on various regulations that have exemptions for small businesses, special loans that are available to small businesses that amount to very large subsidies. And you have to ask yourself, how much money do we want to give someone just because they're opening up a business? I mean, you start to say, well, that's an option, that's a reasonable thing for you to do, but should taxpayers, should an ordinary worker, should someone who's working at a clothing store, should they have to pay more money in taxes because someone across the street from them opened up a business, which might well go under? I mean, a lot of people open businesses and it's a bad choice for them. A lot of people, most small businesses fail. I mean, I understand people want to give it a try and everything, but we're not necessarily doing them a favor to say, take all your life savings, borrowed to the hilt, and then struggle for 3 years and end up with nothing. We're not necessarily doing them a favor. So I just say we need clearer eyes on this. And some of the practices I mentioned in the book, we exempt businesses, small businesses, from safety regulation. So I was particularly struck by this with mining, that if you're a mine owner and you're below a certain size, you're not subject to safety regulation. Well, I'm no more anxious to see a miner die in a small mine than a large mine. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense to me. So you have to look at this, I think, with clear eyes. So we do want people to have opportunities to open small businesses. I think it's a good idea to have special loan facilities, sure they have adequate access to capital. When we award government contracts, make sure that they're accessible to small businesses. So there's all sorts of things that we should do more of, that I think are very reasonable in terms of allowing a level playing field between larger and smaller businesses. But on the other hand, I think we often have gone overboard. It doesn't make sense to tax people to give money to someone just because they've opened a small business. That's not a badge of honor. I mean, I don't think anyone should pay higher taxes just because their neighbor opened a small business. Well, it's only threatened politically. There's a lot of people who want to cut it back. But in terms of the viability of the program itself, we don't have the latest projections, new projections, I should say, post-crash projections from the Congressional Budget Office, but their projections that they put out last summer showed the program could pay all benefits through the year 2049 with no changes whatsoever. And even if we never did anything, it could still pay about 75% of projected benefits, which would be higher than what retirees are getting today. So what that would mean is if we just put the thing on autopilot, never paid any attention to it at all, 2060, 2070, 2080, retirees in those years would be getting considerably more money than retirees do today. So this idea that there's some huge problem there, that's simply not true. There's a long-range problem that stems from the fact we're projected to live longer, which hopefully will be true. Somewhere down the road we'll have to make adjustments, and that could take the form that we might raise taxes some at some point in the future, might decide to raise retirement ages. Maybe people have to work a little longer into their life, but that's a distant problem. It's very different from the way it's being portrayed, that here's this program that's about to go bankrupt. And it's particularly pernicious that people are talking about doing something to it now, because the people, the workers in their 40s, their 50s, even 60s who are about to retire, they've just seen everything they worked for disappear. If they had equity in their home, much of that equity has just disappeared. They had put money in a 401k. Most people, of course, haven't put very much in 401k or retirement plan, but let's say they had. They just lost 30, 40% of that. So the idea that you would take money away from these people at the edge of retirement who've just lost trillions of dollars, the loss to older workers or retirees is on the order of $15 trillion, that we would look to take away the Social Security from them, that's really pernicious. And it's remarkable to me that you have so many politicians that are willing to get up there and say that. Actually, I shouldn't say that because they usually don't put it in those terms, but that is what they're trying to do. So it faces a very real political threat. Remarkably, the biggest threat is from the people who brought on this disaster. I mean, I look at Peter Peterson, who's certainly a big advocate of cutting Social Security benefits. Here's a man who worked on Wall Street, got very rich working on Wall Street, and he's using much of the money that he earned to try to undermine Social Security so that other people can't enjoy a decent retirement. So it's incredibly pernicious, that both this effort to take away the money from people who've worked for this, they've paid in for those benefits. We're not giving them a gift. They paid for them. They paid taxes for them. And secondly, that the people who are leading the charge are exactly the same people who brought on this economic disaster. Well, I don't know if there's a single model we'd want to learn from. I think you want to take bits and pieces from a number of different models. But I think if you look to Europe, I mean, some of the things you could say pretty much across the board. I'm thinking Western Europe, obviously the countries that are closest to the U.S. in living standards, that they do work many fewer hours, and that is something that I think people there value. The idea, I know many Europeans, they're amazed. I think many of them don't even believe me when I say that people here don't have vacations. I mean, obviously a lot of people do, but there are many tens of millions of people that don't, and there's certainly no guarantee of a vacation. So paid time off that people know they could get 4 or 5 weeks vacation, which is absolutely standard in Europe. Some countries, Denmark has 6 weeks. So I think that's something that's very valuable. Give people time off. Again, parental leave. Conservatives like to see women stay home with their kids. I don't care whether it's women or men, but the idea that people have that option, I think that's very good because it's a real strain for people to juggle a job and work. So that makes a big difference. Energy use, across Europe, average energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, about half of what is in the United States. So even though they have very comparable living standards, they use much, much less energy. Part of that is that they have more mass transit. Part of it is it's more concentrated, people live closer together, which people wrongly say in the United States it's because we're such a big country. That's really not the case. I mean, obviously we're a big country, but that's not why we're so spread out. We have land use policies that basically promote sprawl. And in Europe, they've quite consciously designed policies that have been intended to fight sprawl. And I think it would make sense for the United States to do that as well. Make it easier for people to live in the cities, make it easier or near in suburbs rather than build out 90 miles, have people commuting an hour and a half each way each day. So there are a number of different practices that we could take from across Europe. And again, I don't think any single country we'd want to hold up as a model, but I think they're common practices that take different forms that we could look to across Europe. Canada also, I mean, it's not just Europe. We really are the outlier among the wealthy countries in a wide range of areas. World Bank, I think, has often played a fairly pernicious role over the last few decades, really supporting a lot of bad projects, development projects. I mean, a great example here is Chad, building an oil pipeline there where everyone knew the government in Chad was corrupt, and the World Bank made a big point of insisting that they were going to have all these safeguards to ensure that the money from the pipeline went to helping the poor people in Chad, one of the poorest countries in the world. And lo and behold, what happened was the money went to the government. They used it to buy arms. It's just an example. I mean, they've had things like that all over the world. They've also promoted privatization in a wide range of areas where I think it was often inappropriate. One I'm most familiar with is Social Security in Latin America, where they've gotten almost every country in Latin America, Brazil's the big exception, to either wholly or partially privatize their Social Security system. And almost invariably, it's led to very high costs, poor coverage rates, really not very good outcomes. And they've done that with water systems. So they've very much promoted an agenda which certainly serves a lot of corporate interest, often has not served the people who they're supposed to serve, which is the poor of the world. So in principle, I mean, the World Bank's mission, if you go into the building, and it really is kind of remarkable because it's a very opulent building. I mean, no one objects to people having nice offices, but it's really quite opulent with this big fountain, big atrium. And up on the wall it says, "Our dream is a world free of poverty." And it's amazing they did that, and there's no sense of irony to that. Anyhow, I mean, their mission's a very noble one. Unfortunately, I just don't see them having done very much to advance it over the years. Well, I definitely say I'm progressive. In terms of some of the roots, I mean, very much coming out of Keynesian tradition, I think one of the most typically, I'll say, I think the main economic problem we often face is a shortage of demand. I mean, this contrasts with the conventional economic view, certainly in this century, well, this century, the 20th century as well, of seeing the main shortfall as being scarcity. And I think we do see scarcity at times in terms of too much demand, too few goods and services. But I think more typically we actually do see too little demand. I think that is more typically the case. But the other place where I think I differ with some of my friends, and this really just comes from thinking through things, is that I think it's important to distinguish between wanting a role from government sort of as an end in itself, as opposed to seeing the government as a steerer of markets. And I think a lot of progressives have sort of wrongly created this dichotomy between progressives liking government and conservatives liking markets. And what I've tried to argue in much of my writing, certainly the book The Conservative Nanny State, was that conservatives really do like the government. They want the government to play a very big role in the economy, but in effect, they want the government to set up structures so that income flows upward. And what I've tried to look to is how we could undo that, how we could reverse that, so how we could have the government basically structure markets so that income flows to those at the middle and bottom. And that doesn't necessarily mean a bigger role for government than what the conservatives envision. In some cases, it might mean a smaller role. I talk about copyrights and patents. Well, copyrights made Bill Gates a very rich man. I don't want copyrights, but copyrights are a real big government intervention. Same with patents, drug patents. Drugs are very expensive because the government gives a patent monopoly. If we didn't have patent monopolies, we could buy all our drugs at Walmart. I won't ordinarily do Walmart commercials, but here I will. We could buy all our drugs at Walmart at $4 a prescription. But we can't do that with many of the drugs we often need because Pfizer or some other company has a monopoly and they're going to charge us $500 for a prescription. So I would say that there's not any link between progressivism and big government. It's really a question of how we structure markets, and I just think we have to think more carefully about the way markets are structured today to cause income to flow upwards, and then think of how we could structure them in different ways so that incomes flow downward. Many of the libertarians, or self-styled libertarians, I think really are not. They want the government to structure markets in ways that cause income to flow upward, and they call themselves libertarians because they don't want to pay any taxes. So that's basically how they see that. Now, you do have more honest libertarians that do, they won't always come to the same conclusions as me, but they do raise a lot of the same issues. They recognize copyrights, government interference. They recognize that patents are government interference in the market. They recognize that the government does a lot of things to push income upwards. So I think there might be some room for common cause with at least some of those people. But I guess one of the things I would say in general, where I am very sympathetic to libertarian philosophy, is we should be very conscious of where the government's forcing people to do things and ask, is that really necessary? And I'll just give you a very concrete example. Obviously, I've worked a lot on Social Security, and I very much want to preserve that pretty much as is, not necessarily 100%, but the basic story, a core retirement income, I think is a very good one. We want to preserve that principle. We're mandating that. You don't have a choice. Anyone who works pays into it, and I think that's right. Now, basically, our private pension system has collapsed. Defined benefit plans are going down very quickly. Very few people in the private sector have them anymore. Defined contribution plans, most people haven't put much into it, and as we see, there's no security there. So what do? I would like to see us have a second tier added on to Social Security that wouldn't be mandatory, but you'd be pressured into it. Let's just, and here I'm working on some behavioral economics, findings in behavioral economics in recent years, that if we said, okay, you contribute 3% of your wages to this pension plan unless you choose not to, unless you ask not to. So the default is you contribute 3% of your wages. I think we could do something like that and probably get the vast majority of people to contribute 3%. Again, 3 is not a magic number, but a ballpark, what I think would be appropriate for this sort of second tier that's not mandatory but not fully optional either. And what you'd say in that case, or what arguments I've had with some of my friends on this, is that, well, some people won't contribute. And I would say that's right. Some people won't. But my guess is we'd probably get close to 90% of the people would contribute most of the time. Now, the question I'd ask is, how much work do we want to go through to get that other 10% to make them contribute? So if you have 10% that actively are saying, I don't want to contribute to this, I just think as a political matter, it probably doesn't make sense. We're going to make it so it's real easy for you to do it. You're going to have to jump through some hoops not to do it. But if you sat back and you've decided, no, I'm going to take my chances, we already made you contribute to Social Security, and I don't want to touch that. But if you want to say, no, I'm not contributing another 3%, I'll either provide for my retirement otherwise or other ways, or I don't care, I'd say it's probably not worth our while to use political pressure to force people to do it. It's just not good judgment. So I think that's kind of where I give the libertarians a lot of credit. We have to think carefully where we want to use the power of the state, and it would be better if everyone did it, but is it worth the power of the state to force those 10% that really say they don't want to do it? I'd say no, probably not.